Jon, welcome in the flesh.
Derek, it's good to see you and know that you're not AI.
I know. It's hard these days to know what's AI and it's not. You are a YouTuber like me, but much more than just a YouTuber. You do lectures or you go around and also help academics help me with this, track the history of myth as it's in different areas of the world, different stories, where they may have gone, and do the best you can with the evidence we have to figure out where maybe things travel or how they change over time. I mean, various things.
There's a little like that. So I own a data set called the Mythology Database, and that has hundreds of thousands of narratives in, so stories and poems and songs. And along with that data is other metadata, such as where those were told and when it was told and the like. And then scholars and academics can use that data to not only understand where myths could possibly originate, and so therefore have a better understanding of the meaning, but it's also used by social scientists to understand the past and what was going on in the past. And so it's a useful tool for that. And yes, on top of that, I travel around a reasonable amount giving lectures and presentations on it, as this mythology is almost like a glue that can hold genetic, linguistic and archaeological information together. It's like a wrapper to sort of ensure it's all correct.
You mentioned the word mythology, and it's worth first covering what that means, because some scholars, even to this day, debate what ultimately the essence of mythology is. So can you give us a working definition that you think may encompass broadly what most scholars think it even means?
Okay. To do so would be subject to disapproval by many people. So basically, mythology is part of folkloristics, the study of folklore. And no one can really agree what that encompasses. So to try to define something within something that can't be defined is a challenge. But to me, mythology is a genre of story. So you can have folk tales, which are generally fictional. You can have legends, which generally have some historical truth, but some fictional value in them. And then you have myth, which we generally regard as fictional but are considered truthful. So not factually correct, but have a narrative authority. I often say there's sacred truths, like there's stories about gods, religious stories people think are or must be true if you believe that religion. But if you don't belong to that religion and you look at them, you think, well, that's nonsense. Yeah. So it's a narrative authority. So if the person telling it is telling it with authority, then it is relatively mythical if told as though it was back in time. Yeah. But it doesn't have to be ancient as such, because you can have modern myths as well. But I'm actually writing a paper to define this, and that should be out in the next couple of months, to make it easier to understand how myths and legends and folk tales can change, because that's the other thing. It's very easy to stick a pin in something and say, that's a myth. But if you move through history, the myth may become legend, or folk tale may become myth. So stories change, so you want a framework that can adopt that, and that's something I'm working on.
So before we get into some of the meat that's on the bones, I want to talk about the bones a little more about myth here. What purpose does it even serve? Because it sounds like, if we look at it, I think you and I share that we evolved.
Yeah.
So let's approach this conversation as if our viewers are already on the same page. Evolution is a fact, right? That we evolved. We're a primate species. And how does that work? Well, you have tribes, you have groups of individuals often that are linked together, but maybe at some point in the distant past, you would say, well, societies function differently. And there were stories that floated around that told them about the world, whether they've thought them literal history, which is like if we'd had a time machine to go back and ask, maybe one person said, no, I think that literally happened. Another one might go, no, these are stories we tell ourselves, or whatever. It just depends on, like today, you ask yourself. But what does myth serve in that perception, approaching this from evolution? Is it some type of like glue? You mentioned the word glue earlier, that unifies the in-group of that local telling of that story, that sacred narrative, would you say? Like why do we tell myths is the question.
Why do we tell stories?
Yeah.
It's a big part of that. So so myth in particular, it tends to be cosmological. It tends to explain the world around us. It is the science before science.
Mm-hmm.
So if you didn't understand quantum mechanics and gravity and physics and the orbit of the planets, you want to explain why the sun comes up and sets. You want to explain why the moon has certain phases every sort of 4 weeks. And myth was a way, are the stories that tell that. And so that's why they're often divine, because they're related to beings greater than us who are able to control these things. So they really are a way to allow us to understand the world sort of outside of science. And that can become so important to people that even if science comes along and proves the myth wrong, i.e. someone came along and said, no, Earth is not at the centre of the solar system, it's the sun, many people will disregard it, and think that it is tragic. How dare you defile the myth, the story we were telling? It's really quite interesting seeing that. So really a myth is a reflection of how cultures thought about the world around them and why things happened in the past.
And of course, scholars will disagree on the details surrounding that definition or what that encompasses, language, culture, whatever, all sorts of different things, which we're not going to get into too much of that. But it is worth noting they do have different views, different scholars.
Yeah, absolutely.
Specifically, I feel like one of your primary focuses is Indo-European mythology. What is Indo-European mythology?
Okay, so when you say Indo-European, people can become polarized about that a little. So Indo-European is a linguistic family grouping of different languages that seem to have a ancestor language that we all shared. So that ancestral language we call proto-Indo-European developed and changed into languages we see spoken today from northwest India all the way through to Scandinavia, through the Indo-Iranian landscape, through Turkey, Greece, Italy, and up to Eastern Europe as well. So it's as a language group, it has nothing to do with DNA or anything like that. It's linguistic. That's quite important to know. However,
yeah, because people have abused.
People have abused. I think Proto-Indo-Europeans are a race of people. They're not. So there are cultures that spoke Indo-European languages and Proto-Indo-European. The Yamnaya is the most well known of those, but the Yamnaya were not the first people to speak Proto-Indo-European, nor were they the only people to speak Proto-Indo-European, and it's probable that not all of them spoke Proto-Indo-European. So it's really, you have to be quite distinct that DNA does not dictate the language you speak.
That should be a given, but it's kind of...
You have to be sure. So it's about the language people speak. And whilst that's important, is language allows you to communicate. And so the stories you tell are more easily understood. So the culture, which involved storytelling, the myths, would, be told and transmitted as these groups of Proto or Indo-European speaking peoples migrated. And they migrated a lot and very well because they had some cultural advantages over other groups, such as they were pastoral farmers, which made them pretty wealthy and quite mobile, and they were the people who made best use of wheeled transport, and one of the first groups to adopt wheeled transport, and horse riding.
What?
Wheeled wagon.
Yeah.
So with that, they could domesticate a cow to pull a cart, and so if you're farming cows and they need a field, and your grass field is now eaten up and has no more grass, you move to another field.
Simple.
Very successful.
Now, what were the alternatives here?
Agricultural farming,
so
which you see to the Near East, what was very famous to the Near East and went across the northern Mediterranean most prominently.
So you have a nomadic-ish, or at least nomadic possible group, right, which can move if necessary.
Yes, there is sedentary behaviour in there. They do settle, but yes, they also have the ability to migrate. Exactly.
But it's a much more mobile option versus the agricultural, which is cyclical. It's
just
yeah,
exactly.
And that's where civilizations typically become empires in a different way, it seems. Okay. This gets to the Bible, but before we get to the Bible, I just want to ask you one question, because I did a video a long time ago, and it was about the Minoans. They got brought up in it, and there's linear B and linear A, and we haven't deciphered linear B, and I think we're still struggling with some of linear A, but like, there are scholars who think that linear B in the Minoan society has a lot in common with this ancient Sanskrit, if you will, type of Indo-European language. So just to ask you, how far back can we trace as far as we have empirical data, or do we have to go beyond the empirical and suggest, is there clues? How far back does this, what they call Indo-European language, go? And was there a language before that we've identified that gave rise to this thing we now call this Indo-European? And by the way, Indo-European is anachronistic because, again, you're dealing with like the region of where we would say, India and stuff is, and then you got Europe. And so that name itself is a scholarly name that people are just attributing to something that goes way back.
Exactly. So it's an Indo-European language because the Indo-European landscape is where the descendants of the proto-Indo-European language tend to have settled.
Right.
And where we can see the languages being spoken that we can trace back. So how far back does it go? We can use DNA evidence and archaeological evidence for looking at cultures and linguistic evidence. So linguistic evidence is really useful because I sometimes use the term exceptionless, which may not be quite right, but language develops in an absolute identical way. We see that across continents in the world. Different languages develop in the same way. Sounds turn into other sounds, turn into other sounds. So if we see particular sounds in a language, we've got a vague idea how old it is or how it changed from a previous sound, so we can recreate that. And so if we get all the Indo-European languages spoken today and push them back, we get to an age of probably, I would go back to about 6,000 BCE. 4,000 BCE is where most people think the starts of the Yamnaya culture, which most people refer to as the Indo-European culture, really started. But certainly it was before then. And those people tended to live somewhere between the Dnipro River off the Black Sea, Ukraine, to the Volga north of the Caspian Sea.
Got it.
So there's an area, the Pontic-Caspian Steppe, we call it, which is north of the Near East. So if you go up the Near East into Syria and Anatolia, you'll hit some mountains, the Caucasus. The other side of that is the Black Sea, and where we think the Indo-Europeans were. And most people think that is a real physical barrier that no one would cross. So no one in the Near East knew anything about the Indo-Europeans, and the Indo-Europeans didn't know about the Near East, allegedly.
It's kind of funny you bring that up because Gog and Magog, literally the description of the wall that Alexander the Great builds between the north and south is that very pivotal region. And you kind of wonder if there's like this old vestigial kind of idea that people have, like there's no way they would cross over because those are those cannibal, completely ruthless, lawless people up here. We're civilized down here. So I feel like there's still continuity or something.
The Greeks considered it the end of the world up there.
Yeah.
Much like the Gibraltar was one end of the world, the Caucasus was the other end.
Super interesting, and there's so much more there. So the question I ultimately wanted to lead up to while we were defining things and kind of wrapping our minds around this linguistic group and how that would spread with culture and storytelling and all of that is that I know that some of these stories that are floating around there are similarities, if you will. You could tell they're family groups of stories that come from the Indo-European family groups of narratives being told.
Absolutely.
And I say family groups not as in like genealogical tribe, even though there probably are that later, simply the linguistics and showing there's a commonality of narrative in the terms of stories, myth. So the question I have is if we stripped away Indo-European myth out of the Bible, what do you think remains?
That is a simple question that has a very complicated answer, Derek. So it would be easier for me to tell you what Indo-European could be stripped from the Bible.
Okay.
Because that's where my specialist area lies. But we also have to remember that cultures weren't just Indo-European or just agricultural. Greece, for example, is an absolute prime example of an agricultural type culture where Indo-European has gone in and take it up a little and then come in again and shake it up a bit more. And you get this whole mix where you can't tell, are they agricultural or are they Indo-European? So there isn't sort of a black and white there. As you say, there's a Greek story in the Bible and the New Testament, the Gospels, you could argue have some influence from Greek writers who studied Greek myth. So you could say that, but then say it's Greek doesn't mean it's necessarily Indo-European. It just means there is some Indo-European influence there. In terms of true Indo-European stories that are definitely from that neck of the woods, there are two key ones in the Bible. One is they're both around cattle, dragon slaying. Okay,
yeah,
they're the biggest. So there's a lot of dragon slaying in the Bible, or more than people realise, because most people think there's none. And by the time you're in verse 4:1 of Genesis, or to 1:4 of Genesis, you've already got a bit of dragon slaying in there. That's how I perceive it. That's a synopsis of the enumeration. Marduk blowing winds down Tiamat's mouth to kill him, to split Tiamat into two. Splitting Tiamat into two is a dismemberment, a creation myth. And
is that why there's a chiastic structure, you would argue, in Genesis 1, where there's a splitting of the sky, right? The splitting of land from water, a splitting from the animal from animal. Like it's a demythology.
That's in that. Oh yes, yes. It isn't. That isn't directly the dismemberment myth. The first 4 verses are the dismemberment myth revised, and I see that as if people are telling a story. Many of them at the time, let's say 1000 BCE, if you started saying that, they'll know, you're talking about the enumeration type story, whatever that was called at the time. So they know what you're talking about, and then you just extended it, and so that you've already got the audience on your side. That's how storytelling worked. Most old storytelling told you what was going to happen in the story before they told you the story. That's how it was, in case you probably fell asleep or the story lasted 3 days and had to go and kill a buffalo or something in the middle of it, so you knew what was going to happen. We see that all the time. So dragon slaying is important, and the big dragon slaying myth of the Indo-Europeans is a cattle raiding myth, where a dragon steals cattle, because cattle are really important. They're creatures from the gods for Indo-Europeans, because they are the perfect animal. You can use every part of them. So they become so important, and in some aspects so sacred. In Hinduism, they become the sacred animal. So that's just a
literally holy cow.
Literally holy cow, yes. So you have that, and so if you look at David and the Philistines, that is there's a cattle raiding myth slap bang in there, and we see cattle raiding myths then go into Africa and down the Nile. There are instances of more cattle raiding myth, and that has to come from pastoral farming, and pastoral farming started with Indo-European speaking peoples. There was cattle farming, but in terms of it being the primary thing and the dragon story, that seems to have been developed there. Now, we've all gone off topic with the dismemberment thing.
Yeah.
So the dismemberment of a large being to create the world, the split in two, the enumeration is about 1500 BCE, dated-wise. The Rig Veda has a very similar story, Indra versus Vitra, dated 1500 BCE. Now, I'm not saying that Indra versus Vitra directly influenced the enumeration, or the enumeration directly influenced Indra versus Vitra, but they both have lots of similarities in terms of what type of god it is, the weapons being used, where the fight was happening.
So you're not closing the door, but you're not being a scientific certain.
No, what's more likely is there was an earlier story that both came from.
Okay.
So if a story went to northwest India and went into the Near East, 1500 BCE, and it was about dismembering a creature to create the world, and we see this dismembering of a creature to create the world in other Indo-European stories, which we do, but we don't see them in Neolithic agricultural stories, such as the Greek creation myth, and there's many, like the creation myth of Dunu and the like, which is a matricide, patricide, ancestral, kill your family so you can rule type myth, which is very different to killing a big beast and making the world. So it's an Indo-European myth. How does that end up in the Middle East then? It's probably come from Indo-European peoples, although it could theoretically been an earlier myth and survived. But I think time-wise and the evolutions of the cultures at the time would suggest it may not have persisted in Babylon and Sumeria to 1500 BCE if it hadn't had a transmission that was nearer that date. Mm-hmm. So it's probably more likely to be Indo-European. Saying that, there's other stories like David and Goliath. That seems very much like there's Indo-European influence there. Goliath seems like a Minoan or Sea Peoples type warrior. The name Samson, I think in its original form, is like a solar deity name. There's a story in the Rig Veda which is very similar. It's Heracles, isn't it? I think Heracles is
Melkart, Heracles,
is and lions and
Gilgamesh. There's an iconography of Gilgamesh, a statue of him holding a lion with his hand.
Yeah,
but we don't have a story about it. But that happens a lot, right? Where you find a piece of evidence, like we have one with Jason from the Argonauts. And there's a giant serpent. I can't remember the name of it, but it's spewing Jason out of his mouth at the command of, it looks like Athena, the goddess. And there's in the background a golden fleece hanging in a tree. And we have this old 600 BCE myth in art, but we don't have the story.
And that's the real problem. So we see this a lot. So when we talk about a culture like Greeks or even a Jewish culture or Indo-Europeans, or even Vikings is a good one. That isn't talking about a point in time at one location. You're talking about several centuries, maybe 5-10 centuries. You're talking about a landscape that may be 500 to 5,000 square miles. Stories will not stay the same. Details will change. You can't say this is the Greek creation myth. When we can default it to let's say Ovid's one because that's common, but there were many creation myths, and they were a slightly different point in them. So when we talk about comparing stories, which is what we do, or I do, we don't actually compare the narratives in their raw form. We actually convert them into what we call mythemes, which are really the smallest part of a narrative you can get. And we make that such that it cannot be corrupted if we take it through translation or through a cultural boundary. So a really good example of this is if I had a story in England talking about it was raining really hard, the story might say it was raining cats and dogs because that's a metaphor we use for it's raining hard. If you take that to France and say it's raining cats and dogs, they'll go, they don't know what you're talking about. No idea. But if you said, ropes are falling from the sky, they go, it's raining hard. So what we would, and if you took that ropes from the sky to England, they'd be going, what? But if you actually created a myth theme saying it's raining hard, as that, then you can compare the stories accurately. So what we do is we create all these myth themes for stories, and then we compare them and see which are similar. And that's basically what I do when I'm not doing YouTube and other research. So, and so when you look at a culture over a period of time, over a landscape, whilst the stories look different, if we break them down into myth theme content, we can then say, sometimes with confidence, actually they are all the same. It's just that things change, so the details change. Kings don't want older kings' names in the stories, and animals may change from cows to horses because they were seen as better beasts 1,000 years down the line and things like that. So that's why stories sound different, but actually the detail will be the same. And there's been a lot of research on this, and those details, those myth themes, do persist for thousands, if not tens of thousands of years, the core structure of a story, remains.
It's interesting because hearing you describe the method of how scholars, I like to call them mythologists, that are diving into where these myths, tracing these myths, trying to track them and see what commonalities, and then also identifying that there are differences. A lot of people, I get this accusation all the time, will say, I do parallelomania. And to them, they define that ultimately as meaning you think this myth that looks like that myth means that there's connection.
A topological understanding rather than a genetic.
I used to make that more genetic in some cases, and guilty as charged. You can put me in the category of making parallels.
It's natural human thought.
Yeah. And I say all that to say, I've kind of gotten to a position where unless I can really make a strong case linguistically or really make a strong case for whatever reason, archaeologically, whatever, I will probably end up saying, I think there's some communication happening here, or they have common source or something like that, which is more of the scholarly take. But do you ever run into situations where you're looking for that myth theme and you guys might actually go, well, this is a guess here because this actually might be something completely different because you know what I'm saying? There's not all of this is going to fit nicely into like a perfect.
And you do have to be careful. The flood myth is a brilliant example of this. So we see the flood myth almost ubiquitous as a myth for cultures. Every culture feels like it's got a flood myth. That's not quite true, but if it was probably certainly half the cultures in the world probably have a flood myth. And so people think there must have been a giant flood. And so they've all got the story from that. But actually, what we believe has happened is the early creation myths tended to have a world of water, of which land came from. And then later on, around 30,000 years ago, we see what we believe was a shift in Asia, Central or Southeastern Asia, where that turns into a flood myth. So the world has been created and people living on it, and then a flood happens. And that's the story of a recreated Earth, a rebirthed Earth. And then the fact that there are floods all over the world anyway just allows that story to persist more easily, and people can relate it to their own cultures. And so we see a real mix of that. But the fact is that when we look at stories like Noah's Ark, and Noah releases a dove to get an olive branch, that is an absolute myth theme of the Earth Diver creation myth of the sea world. We know was probably being told shortly after the 55,000 year dispersal of humans out of Africa.
Hold up. You just said something that I didn't really catch before in our discussions. What I typically have thought about when it came to the flood myth was usually 2, maybe 3 ideas. And I want to hear about this earth diver, the earth was water and then land came out and that's where humans are made by the gods and all that. Or however they understand this. I want to hear that again. But with you correcting or at least trying to help me perfect my understanding of how the world stories of myth seem mostly to function. Because I'm not going to say there aren't localized myths that might, along the way. My understanding was they either had the universal global idea that a real flood happened and people had this idea, right? They're working backwards though with that. That's the problem. They're working backwards and it's hard where we're at looking back.
And there is empirical evidence for such a thing to some people. So if you look at the likes of the journalist Graham Hancock, because that's what he calls himself now, he would say the Younger Dryas period, which is a cold event 12,000 years ago, or about that. And then when it warmed up again, all that ice melted and that caused all the floods. And yes, sea levels rose and there was more water around, but it took hundreds of years for the sea levels to rise meters.
So it'd be, for the narrative itself, the narrative would be so exaggerative.
Exactly.
It wouldn't make sense.
It'd be, here comes the flood, and that man would probably die 20 years later. His child will stand there and say, yep, it's coming, it's still coming. And then, it'd take 4 or 5 generations before they can stand on the spot to defend water.
That's not the most probable.
It's unlikely. There will be particular places in the world where we do see extreme sea level rise in a short period, but nothing where a sea level rise over, let's say, a meter in a year happens. That's exceptionally exceptionally unlikely.
So, okay, with that in mind, right, we know that's one model, and it's not just Graham Hancock. I mean, this is so prevalent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then there's the other idea that is usually a complete pendulum swing explanation, and that is, well, humans all over the world just so happen to be made of water and demand water to survive. I know. Humans need water to survive. Who'd have thunk that?
So
right?
do fish, but they haven't got a flood myth.
Right? So
That's it.
what they argue is that humans are usually setting up near water, and therefore waters rise, waters go down, right? The Euphrates and the Tigris are a perfect example in ancient.
Absolutely.
The water will rise drastically, actually. And then we know from even crazy, scary videos we'll see of like mudslides and just wild stuff that can happen in all sorts of different areas everywhere in the world. So then they go, we don't need a unified one story that's spread, right? We have individual experiences of cultures near water because humans have to survive. That gives rise to the narratives around, and it can help explain the model of why there are natives in the land we call the Americas have their own flood myths, and they're totally separated for who knows how long from, we'll say,
Well,
where
we do know exactly how long. But
Okay. Well, I'd be curious to get your mind on that as we talk about this specific myth or any other myth, Earth Diver myth, because I want to hear about that. I think it relates to what you're going to get to. In our audience, I think you're going to love this, so stay tuned. Is that they'll try to explain it through the isolation of like individual, and you can see why. We all see the same sky, so we come up with a story that's the same thing. Or we all experience water floods us. We don't no water, too much water, no good. Got it. But what you just said, and I'm sorry this is long, but I'm elaborating to make the point. You said that there used to be a story prior to these earth flood catastrophe stories that the earth was all water.
Yep.
Out of the earth came land, and then life, animals, humans are made after that. Or help me out.
Okay, so
help me understand.
There's multiple versions of the story, but the general framework of the story is in the beginning there was just water, and the duck is on the water. Now the duck's there because there's no other way of making this happen, and that's fine. Often magical animals appear in myths because they can. So this duck's here, and the duck goes down to the bottom of the water, gets mud from the seabed and brings it up, and when it hits the surface of the water, land is created, and that land spreads and becomes land, and then things happen on the land. And now there is an older creation myth, probably the very oldest creation myth we know, is where there is no creation. The land is just there. There's a tree there, and people come out from a tree in the land. But when I talk about this myth, I say, well, what you tend to find in some stories is that the land starts to allow waves to happen, and when waves happen, wind happens, and that mixes things up, and then life starts to grow and a tree grows, and then we see the world tree type story or myth in which pushes the sky away from the land, so there's room for sky, and you've got a tree trunk, and the tree trunk allows us to understand time and growth. So the world tree is important because its roots are the underground, the trunks in our world, and the branches are in the sky, the heavens. It's a really strong, powerful, consistent, almost archetypal view. There aren't many myths of it, but we do see it around the world. That's more like what you're suggesting. But this view of this sea being, like land being created from the sea, exists, and we see it dispersed such, even into the Americas, that we know it must have been told before humans went to the Americas.
Now, you said something pretty definitive, was that we know when they went. And usually the explanation has been for a long time, and correct me if it's been updated or fixed, and you're front row seat to this stuff that I am not, is that there was a landmass of ice that they traveled across in the north and found their way down practically through Alaska, Canada region, down into the Americas. So there was a bridge between over here to over here, and they brought these with them as stories. And so I don't know if that's still the case.
That's sort of. So In the last glacial maximum period, we would call it, which is the period where ice formed across the whole of the Arctic region and down into the northern hemisphere, there was an ice bridge over Beringia to Alaska, where Alaska is. Although we do believe the first humans that migrated probably used a sea route rather than went over the ice, because we don't necessarily find the evidence we would expect in Alaska for first humans that more into the Americas, which suggests they went round it.
Do you think we've kind of underappreciated our seafaring skills?
Absolutely.
I do too.
But what we also see in myth is that we see 4 distinct, separate migrations into America during that period, because we see different myth types. So, and it's quite interesting that sometimes we see things in myth that archaeologists and DNA and linguistic experts don't pick up for till they have more tangible evidence, because folkloristics is an inexact science, so isn't necessarily taken as, the evidence isn't as strong to STEM scientists.
Of course.
And we get that, but sometimes we say things and they go, oh my God, yes, that all makes sense now. Yes, your story is right. Well, thank you. We did tell you that 20 years ago, but yeah, there we go. But we see stories in North America that are dispersed in such a way and going into South America that we know could have only been there because of not only where they are, but the type of story it is. So if there was a flood myth in South America, which there is, if it was like Noah's Ark, we would say it was probably put there by missionaries.
Right.
But it isn't like Noah's Ark. So it wasn't put there by missionaries. It has come up through a different route, and there are different flood stories. I just gave one with the bird scout and that crash myth, but there are others, the Cabela. There's a fruit called a Cabela we see, and that looks like that may well have replaced the earth diver myth in many places, and that's where someone now goes up a tree to drop fruit. Sometimes the bird pecks, an animal pecks at the fruit and it drops, as opposed to the bird flying, as opposed to the bird diver we see. The story developed, but still the myth themes are persistent. That makes us feel it's confident that they are the same core story that has been told.
Okay, so I love this. And what's funny is you just barely scratched the surface. You dealt with Genesis flood, Genesis creation, and of course, some of these interesting things. My final question on this episode, because I wasn't going to stay tuned, because we should dive in deeper, where there's much more to cover,
Absolutely.
Is how old can we trace this earth diver myth where the earth was water before there were flood stories that were like catastrophes, right? The way that they have them now, separating them in a way from creation. Because really, even Genesis hints that there's a relationship between the flood and the creation. There's still some type of relationship in a sense.
Yeah, so we can talk about dragons, because if actually before pastoral farming, all dragon slaying happened in water or in the clouds, never on land. Isn't that weird? But in terms of the age of the earth diver myth, because we believe the earth diver creation myth turned into the flood myth, and that's just logical sense. Stories go in one direction, much like linguistics. You very rarely have a story where a man changes into an animal as a story evolves. Through time, animals may change into people as stories evolve. So equally, we know that creation myths turn into flood myths. We don't see examples of flood myths turning into creation myths. Therefore, we feel the creation myth was for the flood myth because of the dispersal. The flood myth, we think it's Southeast Asia. That would carry before the last glacial maximum to allow people to go over to Americas, which was about 22,000 years ago. We know people left Africa, the culture of people that we see in the world today, 55,000 years ago. So somewhere between 55,000, and we don't see that earth diver myth really in Africa.
Right.
So we therefore believe the myths probably started after 55,000 years ago, but before the flood myth of 30,000 years ago.
Yeah, I'd love to get into more details. Let's pick this up where we left off, because I think there's so much more. If you haven't already, Jon F. White has a YouTube channel, Crecganford. On YouTube, you can go check him out. Do you have a website as well?
The mythology database, just mythologydatabase.com. It is a academic site, a scholarly site, so it isn't necessarily easy for the average person to use. But if you're interested in the story, give it a go. It's free. You may find out something really interesting. Go there.
Go subscribe to him. Check out his YouTube channel. Check out mythologydatabase.com. And also he has a Patreon for all those who help support him as we do early access, so help support people that you enjoy learning from and want to see more material from. Jon?
Derek, brilliant. Thank you. Take care.